Welcome to the Grace Story Podcast, where inspiring stories are brought to life. This podcast is made possible by Grace College and Seminary, located on the shores of Winona Lake in the great state of Indiana. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Flam. This is the Grace Story Podcast. Today, our guest on the podcast is Dr. Pat Loebs, Associate Professor of Communication Program Director here at Grace College. Dr. Loebs received his BA from the University of Northwestern, his MA from Minnesota State University, and his PhD from the University of Memphis. I can also vouch that during his time at Grace, he has quickly become one of the faculty stars on the intramural basketball court. And Dr. Loebs and his family recently returned from Hungary, where he was a visiting professor at Karoli Gaspar University, a partner university with Grace. Pat, welcome back, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm excited to have you back on the intramural basketball court where you thoroughly dominate our undergrads.
This coming from 3-Point Flam.
Ooh, I like that. I might have to borrow that. It's like going to be my new Twitter handle or
jersey,
something.
3-Point.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being able to join us and willing to join us. We're doing a series. We've already talked to a couple students who have both went to Karoli Gaspar from Grace and vice versa. And it's been great to just learn a little bit about each of their experiences. And I'm excited to kind of get on the other side of the lectern and hear about your time over in Hungary. So first start just a little bit with, how did you hear about the opportunity? How did it come about that you were able to take a semester and go abroad with your family?
I think it was a combination of some really hard work on behalf of some of the faculty and staff and a little bit of fortuitous events. So it began when I knew a sabbatical was coming up and I had a desire to go overseas somewhere. But the options were pretty limited. Grace didn't have a lot of partnerships. So I actually looked at the CCCU website and found this random school in Hungary, Karoli Gaspar, and they were an international member. And so I emailed one of the director of international relations, which seemed like the most appropriate person to ask this question, and tried to introduce our university and say, this is what I'm looking at. Would we be a good, partner school for something? And his response indicated a little bit of interest, and I passed that on to Jacqueline Schramm, who ran with it. And over the course of the next year and a half or maybe 2 years, they visited us. Jacqueline and several other people and Paul Blair visited them, and I think the partnership was formed on paper, and eventually it got to the point where we were ready to sign official exchange policy, and as it happened, that was the same time that I was ready to take a sabbatical, and so kind of looked for something different and had the opportunity. They invited me to come and teach some courses, so we did. And Grace was very gracious to us and allowing, because it's not quite a sabbatical in the traditional sense, but
you still had to work quite a bit.
And it also, as I understand, served Grace's purposes by accomplishing some of the strategic plan in further forging ties with the international community.
Yep, absolutely.
So it served multiple purposes, and we were really happy to go.
So tell us about your family's accommodations, where you stayed, and then what was typical schedule for the Loebs family and for you while there in Hungary?
So I'm not going to say that we were we did everything right, because it was very much kind of figuring things out for the first few weeks. But the university over there was, again, very gracious to us and provided us housing within 3 blocks from the actual university. Now, the university is different from what Grace campus is like. So this is located in Budapest, which is a city of 2 million people. And the campus is not a campus in the traditional sense, but rather disparate buildings spread out all over. So the Department of, what do they call it? The Faculty of Humanities is located in one place, and the Faculty of Theology is elsewhere, and the Faculty of Law is somewhere else. And anyway, but the lodging we had was only about 3 blocks from the Faculty of Humanities, which is where I taught my courses. And they had rented the apartment for the year, so someone else is there now, another visiting faculty member. so they provided it for us, and it was a wonderful location. It was on the third floor of in the inner city. So we were in the old Budapest city. There was the city wall, built to keep the Turks out, I guess, is what technically it would have been. And we were on the inside of that. So the old part of the city, and everywhere you look is ancient architecture, and you realize you're walking down streets that for a millennia have been inhabited or have been trod on by people, and it was a really great experience. So a typical day for me, I taught 2 days a week, 3 courses. I taught a course called, 2 of them I teach here. I taught comm research methods and interpersonal communication. And then I taught a master's level course to Hungarian students who were looking to pursue academics. And that was like an introduction to public speaking in the English language. So very, very basic. English was not something they were well versed with. And so we talked about how to prepare for a conference and that kind of thing. And so we homeschooled. I have one daughter in second grade, and we homeschooled her. We had never homeschooled before, so it involved, going through a workbook, and she learned her multiplication table, and I hope that kept her up to speed. She seems to be doing okay.
Back in school now, or is
back
she
in school now? Yeah, Lincoln Elementary, woohoo! But so on a typical day, we would I would say a typical day I would go in around 9. And either work at the office or teach, depending on the day, until maybe 4 or so. And then we would come, and typically the evenings would be spent kind of exploring the city. There's a plethora of parks, all of them unique. Some had 40 or 50 foot slides down a big steep hill. Others were like a giant human hamster wheel. Others were zip lines. And so the girls just loved to go to the park and explore and play and get some exercise. And then sometimes we would grab coffee or ice cream, or occasionally would dine out at a place. But it wasn't too far removed from what we do here.
Okay.
The difference being you're just in a brand new culture with brand new people, new experiences around every corner. And I think we really enjoyed it. So while I was gone, my wife, the girls were taking violin lessons and continuing over there, and also doing their homework at home. And other than that, they're both readers and played with their little sister and went to the park. And it was a pretty low key affair, but
that's cool.
It's an absolutely beautiful city.
Well, and so. Let's talk about the language. Like, I've heard Hungarian is a difficult language to pick up. As English speakers, was it rather easy to navigate Budapest and teach your classes? Were most of the students English speakers? How did the dynamics of language work for you?
So I'll address the Hungarian language, and I'm no expert in this. Probably Dr. Richter would be a good one to ask about Hungarian language. But as I understand it, it is not only difficult, it is the most difficult because it doesn't resemble anything. Apparently, it is part of a language family that is called Finno-Ugric or something like that. And the idea is Finnish is the closest relation and has nothing in common. So Hungarian is unique in its pronunciation, in its use of vowels, in its use of accents. There's no correlation to any other language. Again, this is as I understand it to be. And therefore, we learned the basics, thank you, please, nice to meet you, entrance, exit, that kind of thing. But I could never carry on a conversation. But the nice thing about it, and this I think surprised me, is that I don't feel like we went through culture shock at all, because it was in every way Western. All the systems were the same. So if you could read a map, you could get anywhere. The restaurants work the exact same way. You walk in, you point to something on a menu, they bring you the food, you pay, you leave. There was no huge cultural shifts that we really had to adjust to. And most people speak English in a pinch as well.
Okay.
So it really wasn't all that difficult to navigate. In terms of the classes, 2 of the classes I taught were part of a system called Erasmus, and it's a international system. So the students in 2 of those courses were all from other countries, not Hungary.
Oh, okay.
So I had one course of 24 students representing, I believe, 14 countries. So
Wow.
Japan and South Korea, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, France, Romania, Ukraine, Poland, and probably some others that I don't recall. And all of them, they knew English as a second or third or fourth or fifth or sixth language. And so it was good for me, I think, a little bit of a stretch to, when you teach in an all-English environment like Grace or anywhere in the United States, you fall back on the idioms and colloquialisms that are common in our language use. The metaphors we use, the similes and things, you don't think anything of it.
Right.
But you are constantly aware of the things you say and realize that they may not understand. So I would find myself, I don't think in a condescending way, but to say, does this make sense? Am I speaking in a way that makes sense to you? And most of the time it worked, but there were a few times when they said, I don't understand what that meant. But it also provided some really cool opportunities, activities that you could never do here. Like we had a whole lesson on nonverbal communication. And so I made a list the night before of gestures we use, like the crazy gesture or the like let's go gesture or things like that. Or, like I'm watching,
Yes.
time to move. And I did this with them and said, do you know these? And they knew some of them, and others were like, oh, that makes sense now.
Interesting.
And then I learned some from them as well, some Portugal gestures or Portuguese gestures and some South Korean gestures. And then it's other things, like we did another one the same day on nonverbal where I asked the students to think of a story they have, an experience they've had with an animal. Like it could be a pet, could be at the zoo. And I would like you to turn to someone who does not speak your native language and explain the story in your native language using as many gestures as possible so that the message becomes as clear as it can. And they said, right now? And I said, yes. And instantly it was like this cacophony of language. I'm hearing Portuguese and Spanish and South Korean and French and just, it was amazing. You could never do that in my classroom here.
Sure.
Because we're limited as to the ability to speak. But it was such a great opportunity to see how, even despite these differences, we have these things in common, these gestures, these actions. Like, how do you explain a dog is, like pant, and everyone, oh, that's a dog. And it was just this really cool.
Some are the same, some are different.
Yeah, some are the same,
yeah.
and some are different. And, big is big. You can use your hands to indicate big or small, but just it's a really cool opportunity to see how you can overcome those language barriers. So,
what a fun subject matter. I mean, to be
yeah.
teaching communication in a classroom like that where you have languages of origin from all over the world, that would be really fascinating. Which is one of the whole points of like a sabbatical and doing something like this, right? Is to learn outside of your normal context.
Yeah, I believe so.
So with that said, tell me about the students that you taught there. And compare and contrast without disparaging either.
Yeah.
Students that you were able to interact with in your classroom there versus students you interact with here in the States, specifically at Grace.
Well, I think for one, there was no expectation of religious association at this university. So students were from universities all over the world.
Okay.
And
so despite it's Christian, but it's not everyone there who attends claims the Christian faith.
It's a different system because, again, as I understand it, Karoli Gaspar is a Christian university, but because it's state-funded, funded by the nation of Hungary, there are some limits as to how Christian it can be.
Sure.
As in, they can't forbid people to enter because they don't hold to a doctrinal creed. That's the part of the liberal, the liberal European kind of way of like education is important and you can't limit it.
Yes.
Sorry.
So compare and contrast students.
So I mean, I thought they were great. There's so much opportunity to discuss. That's probably the biggest difference, is that when you speak to students at Grace, there's an assumption that at least there's the common doctrinal understanding, or there's an understanding that you can reference biblical texts and use them as examples, for instance. There's not that assumption. So, I mean, I thought given the cultural differences and the linguistic differences, the language barriers, I thought they were absolutely great. I told all of them when I left that, this has been a 4-month period where I've gotten to know you and you've gotten to know me. Please consider me a resource. And if you ever find yourself in the United States and need a contact, here's my email and feel free to reach out. I think a lot of them would have loved to come over here to study in master's work or something like that. But I don't know if they were any different in any broad sense. They're all 20 to 22-year-old students figuring things out. There's certainly some cultural differences. Certain things are allowed in Europe that are not allowed in the United States or at Grace. But there's smoking is everywhere, right? So you step outside like all of Europe smokes, it seems. And so you step outside the classroom into the courtyard of the school, and there's a group of 50 or 60 people there with cigarettes, and that's just a expected part. No one condemns it. No one thinks it's a big deal. And that's just part of life. And so you wouldn't find that at Grace, right? But in terms of overall student attitudes, I thought they were fine. They cared about grades, they cared about learning, they cared about, but from a European perspective.
What do you feel like you maybe learned about your teaching, or learned that about the culture around you, or that you are excited to bring back to your role here at Grace as professor and director of the communication program?
Well, for one, I think there's a almost indescribable value to going there. And so one thing I would like to bring back is to encourage others to try it. Students, other faculty. I mean, it's just an amazing experience. At least for me, when I think of Europe, Hungary doesn't really enter into my initial thoughts. I think France, Germany, that kind of the Western side. But Hungary is a beautiful country with an amazingly rich culture and a fascinating history. And so I hope others attend as well. But I've already noticed when I have classes here that I've got as if there's an extra resource I can pull from. So I find myself saying, for instance, when I was in Hungary, this is what I saw. Look at how that contrasts with what we're experiencing now.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I have another pool I can draw from for examples, personal experiences. We were there in a really interesting time where the city celebrated the 1956 revolution against the USSR, and we witnessed it and saw the way they protested and what they cared about. And I can use this in my political communication class, and I can talk about how this is what politics is to a people who were ruled by communism for 40 years of their existence. And it's more stuff to my knowledge has grown, my experiences have grown, and therefore I can more refine what I teach.
That's great. From a faith perspective, you mentioned, it's a Christian university, but they're very open about other faiths and just function in a different manner. How did your faith journey or experience through those 4 months? I mean, what do you think you learned about God, about yourself, that you're excited or thankful for?
Yeah. I think more than anything, and this is one reason that I value the international experience. This
Sure.
is why I do go encounter. This is why I love the sabbatical. And if Grace let me, I would go again tomorrow. It was a fascinating time. I loved it. But I think there's a good lesson to be learned whenever you encounter people who have the same faith but different manifestations of it.
Sure.
You start to, you wonder sometimes, like, what are the core tenets of the faith? And have we in some way in American culture, have we added too much to the faith that may not be necessary? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not in any way trying to disparage doctrine, but where's the line? Because
doctrine and culture, it's hard to,
doctrine
they begin mixing at some point.
How do you separate them?
How do you separate
what is Christian
right.
and what is cultural? And so you just, as your horizons grow and you expand your understanding of things and you just witness more, you begin to just go like, these people are fervent believers, they love the Lord, yet they'll go to the bar and watch a football game or, soccer, and it's not an issue to anybody. And that's just it's an interesting kind of dynamic that I think it's good to wrestle through it and not be complacent and settled, always be willing to grow and be challenged and be uncomfortable.
So somebody listening, student, maybe another professor, maybe just an alum from Grace who's listening to this podcast and is like, I've never really traveled that much. And I would be in that category. I've had a few international experiences on a very limited basis for a few days or a week. But I mean, you were there like embedded for months. Talk about the value of that, of like not just visiting Hungary, but living there, and why you would encourage others, or if you would encourage others to have that similar type of experience.
Sure. Well, I think as visitors to a place, we tend to look at a tour book and find what the top 10 sites and visit them and move on, right? But you miss out on the lived experience of the people who call this place home. And I think being any place we were there just over 4 months, you make friends. And I mean, I'm getting daily texts from my Hungarian friends and how are things at Grace?
What do you use for that?
WhatsApp.
Okay. Yep.
Or Signal.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great. And you, like I said, you make friends. We were taken to one of the other professor. He invited us to his family home in southern Hungary, and we spent a day with his brother and his mother, and they don't speak a word of English, so he translated what was necessary. But my wife got to participate in traditional Hungarian strudel making.
Ooh, and that sounds tasty
we
there.
We had video. It was delicious. And my girls, we just walked around this little town that I don't know if a tourist would ever step foot in. I mean, it's 1,000 people, 2 or 3 hours from the city capital, or from the capital of the city, or capital of the country. Why would you ever go there?
Right.
That's not a tourist thing to do. But doing it, you learn so much about the people and see what they've been through. And, while we were there, the professor took us to a former Russian or USSR army base. And he said, here's the barracks. Here's where they stored the nuclear weapons.
Wow.
And it was like, what? You forget that this is, to the people who lived there, recent history, like 30 years ago recent history. They've all lived through the fall of communism. And they not only lived through it, experienced it, like saw the Russian soldiers and saw them leave. And that's not a tourist thing. That's an experience. And so we did that a couple times, to 2 or 3 kind of little ventures outside of the city. But even in the city, I think I remain convinced that if you only have a brief period of time, number one, go grocery shopping. Don't eat at restaurants. Go grocery shopping, because you will find things that you didn't know existed. You will, and it's the oddest stuff. Like, where do they keep oregano? Well, they don't sell oregano in jars. It's in packets. And it's called something different.
Yeah.
And so then you have to hunt for this stuff and go pay too much for coffee somewhere and just sit and watch people. Find a quaint little place off the beaten path where there's no souvenir shops and just sit. And then finally go to a church and just go to the cathedral and just sit. Don't have to talk to anybody, just sit and realize that the practice of religion is ancient, and it is, and I think like in many places, religious attendance has fallen off, but there are hundreds of these beautiful cathedrals, all of them built, to the glory of God at some point in their history. And just go, not a tourist church, just a church, and just sit and ponder the many who have sat where you are, what they've experienced, what they've prayed for, what they've mourned, and just be in that moment. And I think those are things that are hard to do when you are just coming and going. And we saw this all the time. Budapest is a very, very, very popular tourist spot, but the boats on the river will pull up and unload their 1,000 passengers, and you've got one day, and then you load up and move on, and you miss the feel of the city. And I'll just say, one more kind of for instance. We found a Hungary most of Europe celebrates what they call the day of it's October 31st, so it's the All Saints Day, where it's a chance for native Hungarians to honor the dead, remember the legacies that were left. And so stuff is closed, and in the evening, or kind of all day, but in the evening, families will go to the cemetery where their ancestors are buried and hold small vigils around. You try not to gawk at them, but small vigils around their ancestors, and maybe pray, maybe sing a song, but just remember and leave a candle. And so all the places sell candles on the street. The grocery store sell candles, and everyone buys these. And so we went at the recommendation of some people, and it's very respectful, but these cemeteries are huge, and they're all lit up in candlelight, and they're just beautiful. And it's this just amazing October evening, and all the leaves are orange, and you're walking through, and there's thousands of people all gathered to commemorate those who came before. That's something tourists would never see. And you would not get that unless you were part of it and attended at that moment and knew that this existed.
Wow.
So, man, if anyone who's listening ever has the chance, go. Your life will wait for you here. If you can swing the cost, go. Just make it happen, because it will change your perspective and give you a lifelong set of memories that will forever alter how you think and who you are.
What do you had you taken? You'd led to go encounter trips, but did you do semester abroad or anything as an undergraduate student? Okay.
To the best of my knowledge, my university didn't have anything like that.
Okay. Which Grace does,
Yes.
and many of our students are, and I'm sure you would encourage them, hey, look into those opportunities as they exist for your major to do something overseas.
Absolutely.
But there's also got to be some value in doing it, when you've attended 3 institutions, you have a PhD, you have a family. You have some life perspective to also bring. It's got to be neat to also step away and see it from a different perspective. So the question is, like, where would you go next? Would you kind of like, hey, I want to keep going back to similar locations because I want to continue to learn about a certain people group or region, or would you be like, no, I want to go to a totally different place in the world and experience that?
It's a tough question to answer, because the exploratory, adventurous side of me would love to try something brand new. But the more time you spend in a place, the more relationships you develop. And I want to go see those people again. And I want to further build the relationship, So it's hard to say. But I have a unexplainable kind of love for Central Europe. I've spent a fair amount of time in Austria, having now spent some time in Hungary. I would love to go to the Czech Republic. And I think the really cool part about Europe, and I'm not a world traveler, so it might be like this in other ways or in other places as well. But the cool thing about Europe is because the history was never nationhood, every city's different. Prague is going to be totally different than Hungary or than Budapest. And Krakow is going to be very different from Prague. Even though they're not far away, the culture is different, the language is different, the architecture is different. Everything is different. And so you could spend 6 months just city hopping and barely scratch the surface of that part. So I guess that would probably be the short answer. I would like to try a different place, but in that region.
But in the same region check.
But Grace doesn't yet have partnerships with any school in Prague.
Well, hey, you started the first one, but you have to start do some Googling, see what you can do next.
Yeah.
You got 7 years, right, for the next sabbatical. Well, thank you for being willing to share a little bit about your experience, and I'm hopeful as folks listen to this 3-part series that they are encouraged to think broader and bigger about the world we have around us, that God has made people from every tribe, tongue, and nation, and the opportunity to experience that. I know for me, the few times I have been able to travel have been impactful, and those have always been short trips. And I think something like being immersed in a culture would be so valuable for me at some point in my life's journey as well. So thank you for being willing to share and let us live a little bit vicariously through the Loebs European experience.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Grace Story podcast. Music was written and produced by Dr. Wally Brath, Assistant Professor of Worship Arts at Grace College. Thanks also to our co-producers, Andrew Palladino and Rick Neer. And if you can do us a huge favor and rate or comment on this podcast wherever you retrieved it from, we would be so grateful. Until next time, live your best Grace Story today.